Good afternoon. My name is Hanan Kolko, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about where we are in the U.S. with cannabis law. And I think that the important thing that you first got to understand in the U.S. is that we've got a real dichotomy. And last Friday kind of brought it home to me. Last Friday was 4/20, and Cheech and Chong played at a suburban theater in Westchester County, which is an affluent county just north of New York City. And so a couple of thousand affluent New York City suburbanites laughed at Cheech and Chong's stoner jokes. And so that's illustrative of the relatively widespread social acceptance of cannabis in the U.S. But here's the part that's not funny. In 2003, Tommy Chong of Cheech and Chong went to jail. He was convicted of a federal crime for selling bongs. Not for selling cannabis, but for selling bongs. And he didn't just get a slap on the wrist, he spent 9 months in federal prison. So the critical thing to understand about U.S. cannabis policy is that on the one hand, you've got social acceptance, but on the other hand, our war on drugs is still chugging along. So according to the DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, in 2016, about 575,000 people in the U.S. were arrested for possession alone, for nothing else. That's about 1,500 people every single day in the U.S. are getting arrested for possession. According to a study in 2012, about 11,500 people were in federal prisons for cannabis crimes alone. And the important thing to know about that is that in the U.S., the federal government does only about 1 or 2% of the cannabis prosecution. And of those people, 59% were either black or Latino. So not only is the drug law still chugging along in the U.S., the war on drugs, but a fundamental fact of the American war on drugs is that it disproportionately hurts black and Latino people. Nowhere is white privilege more clearly visible than in the war on drugs. It's also clear that in the U.S., our drug laws are a function of racial bias. I don't have time here to go through the origins of American drug law, but the research is pretty clear that American drug law was not created as a result of well-thought-out public health concerns. It was a function of racial bias. So again, in the U.S., we've got this dichotomy. On the one hand, widespread social acceptance. On the other hand, literally today, people are being arrested for cannabis possession and in large numbers. So let's talk a little bit about some more numbers. The U.S. has a population of about 312 million people. About 297 million people live in states that at the very least have a CBD-only program. Now, the CBD-only programs vary in how robust they are, and some are theoretical, but at the very least, if you think about kind of the extent of cannabis acceptance in the U.S., that's the widest range. About 62% of the population, 195 million people, live in states with a state law medical cannabis program, and in November of this year, there is a ballot initiative in Utah to have medical cannabis in Utah. And if you know anything about American politics, Utah is one of the more conservative states, and if cannabis can be legalized for medical use in Utah, it can pass a ballot initiative anywhere. We've got about 68 million Americans who live in states where there is an adult use program, or what people call recreational. And in November of 2018, there is a ballot initiative that'll be voted on in the state of Michigan, another big state. Those numbers come from NORML. In terms of what is the public's view, the Pew Research Center issued a poll that was taken in October of 2017, said that 61% of Americans support legalization. That compares with 31% who supported legalization in the year 2000. How big is the American market, the legal American market? According to ArcView Research Group, In 2017, the market generated about $9.7 billion in revenues. That's up from about $6.7 billion generated in 2016. And some of the states that have passed ballot initiatives have not fully gone online. Massachusetts is just going online now. California is just going online. And so there are projections that the U.S. market could be as big as 20 million by 2020 or 2021. So the American market is big and growing. Obviously, one of the things that we have in America is when a state passes a law, they impose a tax. In 2017, Colorado tax revenues from cannabis were about $247 million. The other thing that we've got in the U.S. is an awful opioid epidemic, and the American Society for Addiction Medicine has data that shows that in states where there is a legal medical cannabis program, opioid-associated ODs are at a 25% lower rate. So those are kind of some of the numbers to think about when you think about the American system. Now, let's talk a little bit about the legal regime that applies in America. And when you think about the American system, the critical thing to understand is that there are really 51 systems. There is the federal system, and then each state has its own legal system. Because in America, states have wide powers to pass their own legislation. Now, there is a concept that you've got to understand when you think about the interaction between federal and state laws, and that concept is supremacy. And what that means is that where a federal and state law conflict, the federal law is supreme. And that comes out of the U.S. Constitution, what lawyers call the Supremacy Clause, and that's Article 6, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And to the extent that there is any conflict, federal laws are supreme, and the phrase that lawyers use is they preempt state laws. Now, why does this matter? It matters because there is a Nixon-era law in place called the Controlled Substances Act. And the CSA, which is what I call it, was a giant piece of Richard Nixon's war on drugs. Richard Nixon is long gone, but the CSA is still with us. And again, when you look back at the history, in particular with regard to cannabis, there is no doubt, the historical record is clear, that Richard Nixon's hostility to cannabis users was part of what motivated the way that the CSA treated cannabis. And critically, regardless of state law, the CSA applies in every state. It applies in California. It applies in Colorado. It applies in Massachusetts. It applies equally in every state. And what does the CSA do? Under the CSA, the cultivation, distribution, processing, and sale of cannabis is a felony. And in the U.S., felonies are the higher level of laws. And the crime for a CSA violation, depending on the volume of production, can range up to life in prison. And so the CSA is a serious law, and the federal government, there have been challenges to the federal government's power to regulate cannabis, but the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 2005 case called Raich versus Gonzalez, ruled that the federal government had the power to regulate cannabis even if it was entirely processed and grown in a single state. Now, the critical thing to understand for purposes of interaction between federal and state law vis-a-vis cannabis is that let's assume that you are in New York State, which is a state that I practice in. Let's assume that you are strictly compliant with the New York State law, and New York State has a relatively strict medical law. Compliance with state law is no defense to a federal prosecution. So literally the entire American system, where you've got producers who are complying with state laws, every single one of those producers is violating federal law. They're all violating federal law. And in 2001, in a case called U.S. versus Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, the court ruled that compliance with state law was not a defense to a federal prosecution. So the entire U.S. industry, all of the producers, everybody who puts clones into dirt and who turns clones into oils and who has a retail dispensary, they're all violating federal law. And in terms of that, I want you to think about one thing. One of the features of the U.S. system is that many states require the producers to buy software and to provide real-time data to the state regulatory authorities with regard to clones being put into the ground all the way to a product being sold in the store. That's what they do in New York State, and actually in New York State, every individual plant gets a barcode, so at least in theory, if the software works, you can know which plants went into the batch that you're buying. It's a quality control thing. But think about it like this. That means that New York State has now got a couple of years of data about the producers there, precisely how many plants they put into the ground and how much they sold. And so in theory, you could have a hostile prosecutor, a hostile federal prosecutor, subpoena those state databases and use them as a basis for a serious prosecution. So again, there is this looming threat out there. So we've got the federal system where every single bit, anybody who touches the plant is violating federal law. And then we've got states that have varying types of programs, that have medical programs, that have adult use programs. And so now the question is, how did the federal government address this conundrum? So there was a time when our president was Barack Obama. And during the Obama era, the U.S. Department of Justice, which is the agency in the U.S. government that enforces federal law, issued something called the Cole Memorandum. And that was issued on August 29th of 2013. And people call it the Cole Memo. Now, what was the Cole Memo? Well, the most important thing to know is what the Cole Memo was not. The Cole Memo was not a law, and it was not a regulation. And those are terms of art, and by that I mean it wasn't a law, because once a law is passed, it is in effect until it goes through repeal. Once a regulation is implemented, it can only be changed in compliance with the Administrative Procedures Act. So it's hard to change a law, and it's hard to change a regulation. But the Cole Memo is neither. It is simply guidance. It was guidance to federal law enforcement officials. But critically, because it was not a law and because it was not a regulation, it could be torn up at any time. Now, let's talk about what the Cole Memo said. What the Cole Memo said was, if you are in a medical state, and if you are operating in compliance with state law, and if you don't contravene certain federal enforcement priorities, then federal prosecutors, as a matter of discretion, are urged to not initiate Controlled Substances Act prosecutions. And between August of 2013 and January of this year, the Cole Memo was in effect, and really the U.S. industry kind of grew up under the protective umbrella of the Cole Memo. And people, that was what they looked to. Now, you might have heard, word might have reached, that we got a new president on January 20th of 2017. And President Trump, as was his power, appointed a new Attorney General. The Attorney General is the chief official in the Department of Justice. And our Attorney General in the U.S. is Jeff Sessions. And so, as of January of 2017, or I guess Sessions was confirmed in the spring of 2017, once Jeff Sessions was confirmed, he was the person with the ultimate power to guide federal enforcement of the CSA and to determine the fate of the Cole Memo. And Jeff Sessions has a long and documented history of hostility to cannabis. When he was speaking before the Senate during his confirmation hearing, he said, quote, "Good people don't smoke marijuana." So the appointment of Jeff Sessions should have made people nervous. I think there were some people who thought that Trump wasn't going to touch the industry. Other people thought that he had too much on his plate. But anybody who paid attention to Jeff Sessions knew that there was a risk that he was not going to let the Cole Memo continue. And on January 4th of this year, Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole Memo. So as of January 24th, we are in a situation where we've simply got state laws and we've got the federal law. But there is one other important aspect of U.S. law that is still there, and that is called Blumenauer-Rohrbacher. And that is a part of the annual federal budget, and what it says is that the U.S. Department of Justice cannot use any of its money to prosecute people who are complying with state medical cannabis laws. So Rohrbacher-Blumenauer is great, but it's got to be renewed every year because of the way that the U.S. budget process works. And with the last budget, there was some real risk that it would not be included. And so everybody in the industry in March, when we finally passed the budget, until we knew it was going to include it, was nervous. And I don't think anyone should predict whether it will survive when the U.S. budget comes up again in September. And in any event, we've had trouble passing budgets, so no one knows whether Rohrbacher-Blumenauer will continue, but for right now, it provides important protection. I want to talk very quickly about a few specific problems that the clash between federal and state law impose on the industry. One problem is there is something called Section 280E of the U.S. tax code, and for purposes of this talk, suffice to say that it means that state legal cannabis companies have a far higher tax burden than any other company. They are not allowed to take deductions that every other company are allowed to take. Banking in the U.S. is incredibly difficult for cannabis companies. There is federal guidance which generally allows it. The problem for most banks is that the cost of complying with this guidance is perceived to outweigh the benefits of accepting cannabis business deposits. Cannabis plant-touching companies can't have access to federal bankruptcy courts, and so that means that when a business is in distress, they don't have an orderly way to wind down. And so there are practical legal problems that until we get our system squared away that people in the industry have. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is what does the future hold? And my first point is no one should make political predictions in the U.S. with great confidence. You could ask President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, about that one. But that being said, I think that there are reasons for optimism. First of all, in response to Jeff Sessions ripping up the Cole Memo, Senator Gardner, Cory Gardner from Colorado, a Republican, used his power. The U.S. Senate gives unique power to individual senators. He held up Department of Justice nominations for 3 months until finally Donald Trump went to him and they spoke, and Donald Trump made 2 commitments. 1, they're not going to go after the Colorado industry, and 2, that, quote, President Trump has assured me that he will support a federalism-based legislative solution to fix this states' rights issue once and for all. Now, that's not legislation, and whether or not President Trump will honor his promise is to be seen, but it's progress. There are other positive signs. Mitch McConnell is the Republican majority leader in the U.S. Senate, the most powerful person in the Senate. He's from Kentucky, and that's a big tobacco-producing state, and it's a state that's got a lot of potential for hemp. And he's introduced a piece of legislation that is co-sponsored by Ron Wyden, who's a liberal from Oregon, that would make hemp lawful under U.S. law. And under U.S. law, that is defined as any plant with a maximum THC level of below 0.3%. Senator Chuck Schumer, who is the minority leader in the Senate, the most powerful Democrat, announced on 4/20 that he was going to introduce a bill that would essentially deschedule cannabis and fund research into THC. There are some other pieces of legislation that are out there. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey introduced the Marijuana Justice Act. That's been introduced by Kirsten Gillibrand, senator from New York, and Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont. And that would make cannabis legal as a matter of federal law. It would require federal courts to expunge cannabis convictions, and it would allow those in prison to petition for resentencing. John Boehner, who was the Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker of the House during the Obama era, he's retired, and he just announced that he joined the board of a major cannabis company. And so perhaps the tide is turning in the U.S., and what I suspect is that if there's another conference a year or 2 years from now, that our situation will be different. And so what I would say is, if you are interested in what's happening in the U.S., pay attention because it is evolving day by day. Thank you very much.